Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are taking quite an intensive look at what makes relationships fail, and maybe more importantly, how we can actually rebuild them. We're diving deep into the architecture of resilience using relationship science. It's so precise, its findings are often cited as the gold standard for predicting, success or failure in relationships.
That's absolutely right. When you look at the groundbreaking work in this field, the numbers are just astonishing. Think about this. Just by observing a short interaction between a couple, divorce can apparently be predicted with over 90% accuracy.
90%. Wow. That kind of predictive power, it really moves these issues out of the realm of just like random disagreements, doesn't it? It puts them firmly into the category of predictable systemic behavioral failures, which means the outcome isn't determined by what you argue about necessarily, but how you argue.
Exactly. So our mission today is really a masterclass in behavioral architecture. Think of it that way. We're going to dissect the sources to understand not just the surface behaviors, the famous four horsemen of the apocalypse that people might have heard of, but also the underlying psychological machinery. We need to spot the deep roots of these destructive cycles. Are they driven by attachment patterns, cognitive dissonance, identity fears? And then, most critically, arm you with the communication fixes. This is all about building supportive, resilient relationships.
Okay, let's unpack this architecture of failure then, starting with maybe the three most aggressive behaviors, the ones that really actively dismantle that emotional safe harbor a relationship is supposed to be. So the first horseman, and maybe the most common one, right, is criticism. It sounds, I don't know, almost benign, but the sources make it really clear that while a complaint targets a specific observable action like you didn't take out the trash, criticism is something else entirely. What's the subtle but catastrophic mechanism here?
Yeah, criticism is the gateway, you could say. It's dangerous because it transforms a specific issue, like the trash, into a generalized character assassination. The destructive mechanism is that it shifts the focus from, say, we have a problem with trash removal, to you are fundamentally lazy and inconsiderate. See the difference? It judges or rejects the person, not just the behavior. So instead of complaining about the trash, the criticism becomes, you're responsible, you never think about anyone but yourself. That kind of thing.
And the problem with criticism, I guess, is its ubiquity. It's just so common. Couples tend to accept it as, like, normal fighting. But the research confirms that when criticism becomes pervasive, when the negative descriptions of the partner start outweighing the positive acknowledgments, well, it destabilizes the entire foundation. It paves the way for the other, much deadlier behaviors.
Precisely. And once that foundation is weakened by judgment, by that constant criticism, we move rapidly to the second horseman, contempt. And this is universally regarded as the single most toxic behavior in relationships. It's the #1 predictor of divorce, and maybe even more disturbingly, it's the #1 predictor of infectious illness in the partner who's receiving it.
Wait, hang on. You're saying relational contempt can predict physical illness? That seems like a huge claim.
It is a huge claim, but the science actually supports it. Contempt involves communicating true disgust and disrespect. We're talking mocking, eye-rolling, sneering, name-calling, even aggressive humor that lands badly. It's essentially emotional violence, and the body registers it as a profound threat. Studies have actually shown that couples characterized by high levels of contempt, they have higher concentrations of stress hormones and, crucially, lower immune system function. They literally catch colds more often. It's like a poisoning of the relationship ecosystem.
Wow, okay, that completely reframes the stakes. This isn't just about hurt feelings. It's a systemic attack on the partner's actual well-being.
Let's look at that source example you mentioned, the dynamic between Dara and Oliver.
Yeah, this is a classic illustration. So, Oliver is trying to address a recurring issue, household responsibilities. He suggests they use a visual aid, like keeping a list of chores on the refrigerator. Okay, that's a specific solution for a specific behavior, right? Dara's immediate response, though, isn't focused on the list itself. She replies, "Do you think you work really well with lists?"
Ouch. Okay, so she's not critiquing the solution. She's immediately challenging his basic ability to implement it, his competence. Exactly. And the contempt really escalates when Oliver, probably feeling a bit flooded already, asks for 15 minutes just to relax before tackling the chores. A reasonable request? Maybe.
But Dara fires back. So if I leave you alone for 15 minutes, then you think you'll be motivated to jump up and do something.
That statement just drips with skepticism. It questions his inherent character, his motivation, his competence. It's a fundamental devaluing that basically screams, I am superior to you.
And yeah, once that kind of attack lands, the recipient's nervous system is it's fully engaged in threat response mode, which leads us directly to the third horseman, defensiveness. We all feel justified defending ourselves, right? But in this relational context, it's actually a counterattack. It prevents any real chance of accountability or resolution.
Defensiveness is fundamentally a rejection of responsibility. It shows up as playing the innocent victim, or maybe cross-complaining, well, you didn't do X,
Yeah.
or simply making excuses. The sources link this really tightly to a state called being flooded, which is a physiological state of just overwhelming distress. We're talking a heart rate above 100 beats per minute, high adrenaline. When you're flooded, your cognitive functions are dramatically reduced. You literally cannot process complex solutions or empathize properly.
And the research highlights something really fascinating here, if maybe a bit difficult. A gendered pattern in this physiological response.
Yes, the data does suggest that. It seems men are often more easily overwhelmed or flooded by marital conflict than women. When conflict escalates rapidly, the male partner often hits that physiological breaking point faster. But the real issue, the sources suggest, isn't just the flooding itself, it's the cognitive traps they fall into that maintain that distress.
Okay, can you elaborate on those cognitive traps? What do they look like?
Certainly. So when flooded, men tend to process the conflict through one of two destructive mental frameworks. The first trap is feeling righteous and indignant, thinking things like, I'm going to get even, or I don't have to take this abuse. This just reinforces the adversarial stance and can easily escalate into belligerence or even outright contempt themselves. The second trap is playing the innocent victim. Why is she always blaming me? I didn't even do anything wrong. This mindset completely shields them from any accountability and leads directly to defensiveness. They're desperately trying to protect their self-image rather than actually engaging with their partner's complaint.
Right, and that protective instinct, whether it's fueled by indignation or that feeling of victimhood, it inevitably speeds up the final stage of withdrawal, what's often called stonewalling or avoidance. The partner is basically just trying to manage an internal state that feels completely overwhelmed by threat.
Withdrawal is the final shutdown. It really is. It's the partner prioritizing a deep, almost primal need to feel unthreatened and safe again. When the relationship environment driven by criticism, contempt, and defensiveness becomes consistently chaotic, unsafe, or unpredictable, the individual retreats. They put up emotional and physical barriers. This withdrawal reflects a fundamental human tendency, really, to seek a safe, orderly, predictable world, especially when the core relationship feels structurally compromised, feels unsafe.
And we see that withdrawal manifest in measurable communication patterns too, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. The research confirms it. An aggressive or highly critical way of speaking directly leads the partner to minimize engagement. For instance, studies showed that partners, specifically men in these studies dating anxious partners, reported self-disclosing significantly less often. They also rated their general communication quality as lower. The anxiety, which often comes out as criticism or what's called protest behavior, creates an unsafe environment. This leads the other partner to kind of ration their self-disclosure, limit engagement. It makes genuine, vulnerable connection pretty much impossible. Stonewalling isn't usually malicious, It's often a desperate, sometimes unconscious, self-soothing attempt that's born out of that physiological overload we talked about.
Okay, so it's really clear that the horsemen are just the visible symptoms, right? They're the eruption, but the source of the magma, so to speak, is much deeper. Many catastrophic conflicts aren't truly about the surface issue, the dishes, the money, whatever. They're about deep, underlying psychological fears related to attachment and identity. Let's talk about the anxious avoidant trap.
Yes. This is often the engine room for the horsemen. It's really central. We know that attachment styles, particularly anxiety and avoidance, create these highly predictable and, unfortunately, mutually reinforcing conflict patterns. If you lean anxious in your attachment style, you're generally preoccupied with the availability and responsiveness of your partner. You might perceive the relationship as fragile, maybe unstable. Because of that, you tend to anticipate a negative response from them.
And how does that anticipation play out when a conflict actually arises?
Well, it often leads to what we call flooding with negative emotions, similar to what we discussed earlier, but driven by that attachment fear. The anxious partner starts thinking in destructive extremes, catastrophizing the situation. Thoughts like, this argument means they don't love me, or, oh no, the relationship is doomed. This internal chaos makes it incredibly difficult to express needs calmly and constructively. So when the anxious partner finally does speak, it's often in a way the sources describe as explosive, accusatory, critical, or threatening. This is basically the birthplace of criticism fueled by anxiety.
Right. And that outburst, that critical accusation, It immediately triggers the counter-reaction from the avoidant partner. The avoidant partner being someone whose core fear is often engulfment or maybe loss of autonomy, loss of self.
Exactly. They perceive the anxious partner's behavior, that criticism, that demand for connection or reassurance as an invasion or a threat to their independence. So their primary response is often to deploy what are called deactivating strategies. These are mechanisms specifically designed to put up emotional barriers and create distance, precisely to reduce that perceived threat of intimacy.
Okay, we need to make these strategies really tangible for the listener. What do these deactivating strategies actually look like in practice? What does someone do?
They can be quite subtle, but they're devastating acts of emotional withdrawal, really. They might involve, say, creating uncertainty early in the relationship, making sure the relationship status stays slightly unclear or ambiguous. Are we serious? Are we not? That kind of thing. Or maybe focusing obsessively on minor, irrelevant flaws of the partner, nitpicking their clothing or their voice or how they eat as a way to sort of internally justify emotionally checking out. Crucially, they might avoid deep conversation or physical intimacy, or maybe use flirtation with others to subtly remind the current partner that, well, they're replaceable. They're basically trying to suppress their own genuine affectionate feelings, because those feelings represent the threat of dependency, the threat of getting too close.
And this dynamic leads to that incredibly powerful concept you mentioned earlier, the phantom X phenomenon.
Yes, it's a perfect encapsulation of the avoidant mindset, I think. When the avoidant person leaves a relationship, or maybe the relationship just fizzles out and ends, they often feel relief at first. That makes sense, right? The distance removes the constant pressure and perceived threat of closeness. But then, maybe months or even years later, they often start revising history. They conveniently forget all the negative aspects, the friction points, and only remember the positive qualities of the ex. Suddenly, the ex is put on this pedestal as the one that got away, or the love of my life. They miss the partner only when the distance feels safe enough to process the affection without the accompanying threat of real, messy, demanding intimacy.
Wow. Okay, so this whole cycle really feeds the core emotional engine of relationship failure: insecurity and dissonance. And you mentioned that insecure conflict tactics always involve generalizing the conflict.
That generalization is absolutely key. Instead of arguing about, say, the dishes, the insecure partner attacks the integrity, the character of the person. Think back to that example of Marcus and Daria. Daria is expressing a specific concern, a fear about faithfulness, a very specific emotional need. But Marcus completely veers off topic. He attacks her character, makes it about money, makes it about her perceived neediness. Remember, he asks, what do you want me to do, lose $3,000?
Right. He totally transforms a specific emotional worry, her fear about faithfulness, into a generalized moral failing on her part regarding money management. He's attempting to control the narrative by shifting the focus onto her supposed shortcomings. That's a classic insecure tactic, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
And this behavior is deeply, deeply rooted in cognitive dissonance. We, as individuals, strive for consistency in our internal self-beliefs. It's fundamental.
Right.
So if I believe I am a loving, good partner, but I just did something that contradicts that belief, like I yelled at my partner or I avoided a really necessary conversation, that inconsistency creates intense psychological discomfort. That's dissonance. And to resolve that pain, our brains engage in pretty immediate rationalization.
Oh, okay. So if I attack my partner instead of admitting I was wrong, which would create dissonance with my I'm a good person identity, I rationalize the attack by convincing myself that they deserved it, or maybe that it wasn't really that bad.
Precisely. And the more significant the inconsistency, the greater the magnitude of the dissonance, and therefore the more extreme the rationalization needs to be. Attacking a spouse's core character requires much stronger justification than just rationalizing why you forgot to do a chore. And we unconsciously seek evidence, confirmation from others even, to support our rationalization. We're trying to add consonant elements to reduce that discomfort. This leads directly to selection bias.
Which basically means we actively filter reality to support our own defensiveness. We see what we want to see.
Correct. Selection bias shows up as quick certainty in our own position, like being absolutely sure we're right. Also, profound defensiveness when challenged on our view, and critically, a selective memory. We only remember the facts that support our preferred conclusion, our story about what happened. The mind sets a significantly higher bar for any facts or evidence that might disconfirm our belief that we are, in fact, the innocent victim or maybe the righteous defender in the situation. This selective filtering makes genuine conflict resolution nearly impossible because both partners are essentially operating in different self-affirming realities.
Okay, we've thoroughly mapped the architecture of failure, we've seen the symptoms, the horsemen, and we've dug into the deep roots in attachment and dissonance. Now, let's pivot entirely. Let's get into the construction manual for resilience. We need specific, actionable blueprints to swap out these destructive behaviors. The first and maybe most critical antidote has to be the reversal of criticism, right? Moving from attack to constructive contribution.
That's right. This is antidote 1, replacing attack with request. Fundamentally, this is about shifting entirely from those accusatory you statements, you always, you never, to constructive, feeling-focused I statements. The purpose here is really to take the emotional temperature down immediately by accepting ownership of your feeling rather than assigning blame to the other person.
Okay, let's contrast those two approaches using a potentially highly volatile situation like, say, driving.
Absolutely. A great example. So the destructive version is pure criticism, maybe even laced with contempt. You are such a lousy driver. Would you please slow down before you kill us? You never pay attention. Notice the multiple generalized attacks there on competence, on care. Now, the constructive feeling focus version sounds more like this. I know how much you enjoy driving fast, but it makes me really nervous when you go over the speed limit. Could you please slow down?
Wow, that second statement is remarkably different. It starts by actually validating the partner. I know how much you enjoy driving fast before owning the speaker's own emotional state, but it makes me nervous. It totally removes the moral judgment and then makes a clear, specific request.
Exactly. And this is where we have to address the common critique, right?
Yeah.
That this sounds wonderful in theory, maybe in a therapy session, but it feels impossible in the heat of the moment. We need to be realistic. Is it truly possible to deploy a multi-step structured I statement when you're already flooded and your primal brain is just shouting, threat?
Yeah, that's the critical friction point, isn't it? The science of relationship repair often gets held up as this kind of checklist that just seems completely unattainable when your partner has just, insulted your core value system 5 seconds ago.
It is hard, no question. But this is precisely why we connect it back to the preparatory mindset, the identity work we'll discuss a bit later. You almost have to make the decision to try to use this structure before the conflict even starts. The structure itself can actually force a degree of self-regulation. So we offer this as the actionable nugget, the sort of field drill for you listening. In your next conflict, consciously try to replace you statements with, I notice I feel I need. Then, and this part is crucial, make a clear request with a time frame as possible and ask the other person to reflect back what they heard you say.
That reflection step sounds really essential. It ensures the request has actually landed, that it was heard correctly, and wasn't just immediately deflected by their own defensiveness kicking in.
Exactly. It slows the whole interaction down, forces a pause.
Okay.
Moving to antidote 2, we need to tackle that insecure tendency to generalize the issue, to make it about everything instead of the specific thing.
Yeah.
This is refraining from generalizing conflict. The key skill here is the ability to separate the surface-level protest behavior, the yelling, the accusations, from the underlying fear or unmet need.
So the secure partner, or the partner trying to be secure, needs to act as kind of an anchor in that storm.
They really do. We see this beautifully in the example of George, who's described as having a secure attachment style. When his anxious partner, Kelly, felt threatened, she launched into that protest behavior, generalizing the issue, making personal accusations about George's character. Now, a less secure person would likely immediately get defensive or counterattack. We'd see the horseman ride again.
Right. But George didn't do that. What did he do differently?
He was somehow able to see through the personal attack. He maintained focus on the issue at hand, not her personality flaws in that moment. And he seemed to recognize that her aggressive behavior was simply a reflection of an underlying, unmet need for safety or connection. By staying relatively calm and addressing her core fear quickly and effectively saying something like, I understand you're scared, I am here, he diffused the generalization and brought the conversation back to a more resolution-focused discussion.
Okay, so the generalization is basically an insecure tactic meant to spread the blame and broaden the attack surface. And the antidote is maintaining this kind of rigid, almost non-reactive focus on the specific, solvable problem at hand.
That's a great way to put it. Secure individuals focus on the problem, not the person. When conflict stays focused and there's a genuine willingness from both sides to resolve a specific issue, both parties tend to feel heard and often end up feeling closer afterwards. Generalizing, by contrast, attacks character. It guarantees defensiveness, and it just creates this huge unsolvable mess.
All right, our final antidote, Antidote 3 seems to move entirely away from fixing problems and focuses purely on building up that relationship bank account. The power of turning toward.
Yes, this is the micro habit, the tiny thing, that makes relationships resilient enough to handle the inevitable conflicts when they do arise. The sources show pretty convincingly that relationship stability isn't primarily based on how you handle the big arguments, but rather on how you handle the hundreds of tiny, mundane exchanges every single day. Turning toward is defined simply as acknowledging and engaging with your partner's bids for connection.
Okay, can you give a more detailed example of a bid and the different ways someone might respond?
Sure, a bid can be incredibly simple. Maybe just a sigh from your partner or a comment on something they read in the news, or even just looking out the window and saying, "Wow, look at that boat." That's a bid. The partner can then respond in one of three basic ways. Turning away, which means ignoring the comment completely, maybe just grunting. Turning against which is responding irritably like, "Can't you see I'm busy right now?" Or turning toward, which means looking up, engaging, maybe saying something like, "Yeah, that's cool. Remember that schooner we saw last year?"
It sounds incredibly mundane, almost boring to analyze these tiny interactions. But the research must show why the seemingly small stuff matters so much.
It's the sheer volume. That's the key. The research found that in couples who ultimately divorced, they only turned toward each other's bids about 33% of the time during these normal non-conflict interactions, only a third of the time. In contrast, couples who stayed together and reported being happy turned toward each other about 86% of the time. Huge difference. That brief exchange about the boat, it's not really about the boat at all. It's about building relationship points, depositing into that emotional bank account.
Okay, this connects directly to that idea of micro habits, the 1% rule people talk about.
Precisely. We tend to vastly overestimate the importance of one defining moment, one amazing vacation or one perfectly crafted apology, and we massively underestimate the accumulated value of making small, consistent improvements daily. If you commit to being just 1% better each day at acknowledging your partner's small bids for connection by consistently choosing to turn toward instead of away or against it, you don't just accumulate affection linearly, you build a relationship that improves exponentially. The math suggests that by the end of just 1 year, you're actually 37 times better at connecting than when you started. It compounds.
So the core message of relationship resilience is actually structural in a way. It doesn't require one massive earth-shattering act of heroism, but rather a consistent daily commitment to acknowledging and validating your partner one small turning toward at a time. Now, to make these habit changes actually stick, to make the I statement feel natural eventually, and to make turning toward more routine, we have to recognize something deeper, right? We aren't just trying to change outcomes like having fewer fights. We're actually trying to change who we are in the relationship. This seems to require focusing on a fundamental shift in identity, not just outcomes.
Yes, this is arguably the highest leverage point for creating sustained change. Change really operates on three layers, you could say. There are outcomes, your results, like fewer arguments. There are processes, your systems or habits, like using I statements. And then there's identity, your underlying beliefs about yourself. We often focus entirely on the outcome, "I want less conflict." But the most effective way to change long-term is by focusing on the identity you wish to embody. Who do you want to be? Every action you take, every instance where you choose an I statement over a you statement is like casting a vote for the type of partner you aspire to be.
Okay, so this means we really have to confront those deeply ingrained, often unconscious patterns that drive us to criticize or withdraw in the first place.
Absolutely. We have to, as they say, make the unconscious conscious. We need to shine a light on the hidden drivers of our defensiveness or our contempt. Carl Jung framed this perfectly, didn't he? He said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." If we don't gain awareness of the deep-seated attachment fears, the cognitive biases, the old wounds that cause us to lash out or stonewall, we're basically doomed to repeat the cycle. And we'll probably blame the negative outcomes on external forces or just bad luck in relationships. Awareness is always the prerequisite for genuine choice.
And part of that unconscious reaction is the physiological flooding we discussed earlier, the moment our body gets hijacked by a primal threat response. How does the science of self-regulation and emotional management inform our ability to build this more resilient relational identity?
Well, we need to understand the nervous system's hierarchy a bit, which is often explained through things like polyvagal theory. When conflict erupts, our system naturally prioritizes survival over connection. That makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. Our autonomic nervous system shifts resources away from optimizing internal functions like digestion, immune response, rest, and repair, and shifts towards optimizing metabolic output for external motor behaviors. That's the classic fight-or-flight response. This compromises our internal physiological homeostasis and creates that state we recognize as flooding, or rage, or intense anxiety.
Okay, so if I'm feeling contemptuous or defensive, my body is literally sacrificing internal calm and balance to serve the external need to win the argument or escape the perceived threat.
That's a good way to think about it, yes. That's the sympathetic activation, or sometimes the dorsal vagal shutdown or immobilization response. But the system of resilience, the system we want to cultivate, is based on the highest functioning part of this autonomic ladder, the myelinated vagus nerve, which is part of the parasympathetic nervous system. This is often called the social engagement system. Its job is to actively reduce arousal, promote calm states, and enable the subtle facial expressions and vocal modulations that support true, safe-feeling social connection.
So real resilience, then, is about consciously training our systems to access that calm connection state more readily, rather than defaulting immediately to the threat escape or attack state when conflict arises.
Precisely. To respond constructively, especially when feeling triggered, we must engage what some call the adult state of consciousness. And this requires conscious effort and, crucially, preparation. You know the saying, you can't teach navigation in the middle of a storm. It's the same here. We have to make some big decisions about our basic relational values, like deciding, I will prioritize connection over being right, or I commit to trying the I statement even when it feels hard before the conflict actually hits. That conscious pre-commitment helps reinforce the adult ego state, giving us a better chance to respond with that I statement when our more primal brain is demanding we attack or run.
Okay, finally, to sustain this kind of effort over time, we probably need an internal toolkit of strength. Our sources define this as a balanced approach to self-compassion and inner strength, and it sounds like this is more than just, being nice to yourself when you mess up.
It's absolutely more than that. It's about a necessary balance. Think of it like yin and yang. The yin energy is acceptance, care, kindness towards oneself, acknowledging the pain or difficulty. That's essential. But it must be balanced by the yang energy, which is about action, motivation, clear boundaries, and sometimes fierce accountability to our own values. If acceptance happens without the corresponding willingness to take uncomfortable but necessary action, like initiating that difficult conversation or using the I statement structure when it feels really unnatural and awkward, then self-compassion can actually curdle into what some sources call idiot compassion.
Yeah, idiot compassion. Okay, what does that mean?
Yeah, it's a provocative term. It basically means complacency or passivity disguised as kindness. It's using self-acceptance as an excuse to avoid accountability or to stay stuck in destructive patterns because changing feels too hard. A clearly strong, resilient relationship and a resilient self requires fierce self-compassion. This means having the courage to look clearly and honestly at what we authentically need in the long run, which often involves tolerating the short-term pain or discomfort of change for the long-term benefit of healthier connection. It means ensuring our behavior is truly in our best interest and aligned with our values, rather than merely indulging our immediate desire for comfort or avoidance. This balance is what allows us to really integrate this new, resilient identity we're trying to build.
This whole shift from character attack to constructive request, from anxious avoidance cycles to conscious engagement, and, fundamentally, from merely reacting based on who we were to consistently voting for who we wish to become, it really is a powerful, actionable framework for relational health. It makes the idea of a resilient relationship feel much more like an attainable goal, something we can build, rather than just a passive fate we hope for. #tag outro.
We've definitely covered a tremendous amount of ground today. We've really tried to map the territory of relational success and failure. We began by identifying that destructive core. Criticism, contempt, and defensiveness, the behaviors that, kind of frighteningly, make relational breakdown over 90% predictable in some studies.
Yeah, and we connected those surface behaviors to the underlying psychological drivers, that anxious avoidant trap, often fueled by a deep search for safety, and also the internal pressure cooker of cognitive dissonance, which leads us to rationalize our defensiveness through things like selection bias.
And then, importantly, we outlined the architecture of resilience, the antidotes, that shift from accusation to request using the I statement rule. The crucial need to refrain from generalizing conflict by focusing on the core fear or need beneath the protest. And maybe most fundamentally, the commitment to the daily, minute-by-minute micro-habit of just turning toward your partner, building connection one small bid, one small moment of attention at a time. True resilience, it seems, isn't really about eliminating conflict entirely. It's probably impossible. It's about creating an environment, a relational culture, where partners feel safe enough, feel unjudged enough, and fundamentally feel heard.
So, to leave you, the listener, with a final thought rooted in this psychological framework we'd explored, the relationship often acts as a profound mirror of our internal world. When our drives or needs are frustrated, aggression can be unleashed. If we want resilient partners who engage with us rather than withdraw or attack, we have to find ways to help manage that natural aggression constructively. The relationship itself needs to provide a pathway for resolution, not just judgment or punishment.
So, maybe consider this. How often does your current approach to conflict, maybe your tone, your go-to criticisms, your defensiveness, how often does it inadvertently turn your partner's frustrated energy or aggression inward, leading them towards guilt, shame, resentment, and ultimately withdrawal? Versus, how often does your approach help them turn that same energy outward, constructively, toward an actionable resolution that actually serves both of you and strengthens the bond? A resilient relationship ultimately channels that inevitable conflict energy toward collaborative problem solving, not towards internal self-blame or external other blame. Something to think about. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today.